Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirla Greenwald. This is a Sicha from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Zayin, Parshas Yisro, Sicha Beis. And the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha, we learn that Yisro suggested to Moshe to appoint judges for the Yidden, and Moshe should not judge the Yidden all by himself. And there are four parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number one, ask what was the thinking of Moshe and Yisro. Moshe did not think to appoint judges, and Yisro thought that it was the right thing to do. What are the two different approaches of Moshe and Yisro? Number two, present where we find a similar idea elsewhere in Torah. Number three, based on that, answer the question. And number four, based on this, explain a number of other details in the story of Yisro and Moshe. It's recounted in this week's Parsha that when Yisro saw how Moshe Rabbeinu sat lishpeit ha'am in abeker ad ha'arev, how Moshe Rabbeinu sat to judge the nation from the morning until the evening, so Yisro said, Madua ata yeshev levadecha? Why are you sitting alone? V'chol ha'am nitzav alecha min beker ad ha'arev, and the whole nation is standing before you from the morning to the evening. Novel tibel gam ato gam ha'am. You and the nation are going to be worn down by this. And Yisro advised Moshe Rabbeinu va'ata techzeh. He was advising him that Moshe should appoint, he should appoint judges that oversee groups of 1,000 Yidden, and then judges that oversee smaller groups, who they will judge the people b'chol eis at all times. And only adavar gadol yaviyo elecha. They'll only come to Moshe Rabbeinu when there's something complicated and difficult that they need help with. And through such an approach, Yisro said, "V'yachalta ameid, you will be able to manage. You, Moshe Rabbeinu, will be able to manage. V'gam kol ha'am hazeh al mekayma yavi b'shalom, and also the whole nation will be able to be in peace." And the question on this is known: how can it be that Moshe Rabbeinu, the Raya Mehemna of Yidden, he himself wasn't concerned that his approach would bring about that novel tibel gam ata gam ha'am, that him and the nation will be worn down by his approach. And it also didn't occur to him the simple solution of appointing judges. And it was specifically Yisro, Kayin Midian, who only came for a short time, who understood this and achieved it. He understood the problem and he saw the solution and he achieved it. How can it be? Now it's known what the Maimer Ilam is saying, that a gast for a while, zet af a mile. In English, that would be a guest for a while, sees for a mile. And specifically someone who's part of the situation sometimes can't see an obvious thing, and you need someone from the outside who's a guest to be able to notice it. However, Chas v'Shalom to say about Moshe Rabbeinu, who the Eibishter chose from when he was born to be the Rei Yisro, and at this point in time he was already the Rei Yisro of the Yidden for quite a while, that he wouldn't understand this, the problem, and see the solution until Yisro came and drew his attention to it. And in answer to this, and as we'll see, it'll lead into a different question. In answer to this, the question itself is the answer. From this question itself, that we pointed out, the Moshe Rabbeinu was the Raya Mehemna of Yidden. And he was chosen to be the Raya Mehemna from birth. And he was already at this point actively the Raya Mehemna for quite a while. And the concern over here is a very simple and obvious concern, and the solution is also a simple solution. So from this itself, it's understood that Moshe Rabbeinu was of the opinion, and on his level it's indeed true, that he himself is able to, and even more so, he himself must deal with judging the Yidden, both by a Davar Gadol and a Davar Katan. Not just by the Davar Gadol and the Davar Katan would be given to others, but rather he should judge the Yidden in all matters. And nevertheless, it wouldn't harm him or the Yidden, and it would be to the extent that it would accomplish what Yisro said his solution would accomplish, which is that Moshe Rabbeinu would be able to manage v'gam kol ha'am hazeh al mekayma yavi b'shalom, and also the whole nation, all the Yidden would be in peace. So from the question itself, it's understood that Moshe Rabbeinu held that this was unnecessary, and he could be the one to judge the Yidden in all matters, and he would be able to manage, and the Yidden would be able to manage. And we can see another proof for this, that Moshe Rabbeinu held this, from the Maimer Chazal, that the name Yeser or Yisro had a number of names. One was Yeser, another another one was Yisro, and he was given one of these names, Al Shem Sheyiter Parsha Achas B'Torah, because he added a parsha to the Torah, which is the parsha of Va'ata Techza, that Moshe Rabbeinu should appoint the judges to be underneath him. Now, since Chazal say Sheyiter Parsha Achas B'Torah, that he added a parsha in the Torah, not that he merited that the parsha was Nemra, said, or Nichtava, or written through him, as we find about other parshas in Torah, that it says that they were Nemra or Nichtava through someone because of a Sichos of theirs. It doesn't say that over here, that it was Nemra or Nichtava through Yisro, but rather that Sheyiter Parsha Achas B'Torah, he added a parsha in the Torah. So it's understood that not only was the parsha of Va'ata Techza revealed through Yisro, but even more so that Yisro, Kivyachol, so to speak, created an addition in Torah. Through him, there became a new parsha in Torah, Va'ata Techza, that if not for him, Torah on its own would not have this parsha. And so it's understood that before Yisro created this parsha in Torah, so from the perspective of Torah's emes itself, the approach was not that of Va'ata Techza, but rather that Moshe would be the one to judge the Yidden b'chol davar, in every matter, both the davar hagadol and the davar hakatan. And this is actually the reason that Moshe Rabbeinu, whose whole being is Torah, conducted himself this way, because this is also the perspective of Torah. We see that Torah on its own does not have Va'ata Techza. It's something that Yisro added to it. Torah on its own says that Moshe Rabbeinu should judge the Yidden, and that's why that was also the approach and the perspective of Moshe Rabbeinu, because Moshe Rabbeinu's whole being is that of the Torah. However, according to this, the other side of things is difficult. We answered the perspective of Moshe Rabbeinu. We said that according to his perspective, and it's indeed true, he was able to be the one to judge the Yidden in every matter. But now the question is the reverse, on Yisro, which is since also through the approach of Moshe. It would accomplish that v'yachol ta'amay, that Moshe Rabbeinu able to manage. V'gam kol amazeh al mekayme yavi b'shalim, and also the people would be in peace. So from where did the concern of Yisro, that the approach of Moshe may lead to novel tibul, maybe it'll lead to a Moshe and the Yidden being worn out, and that it's covered mincha davar, and that the whole thing is too difficult for Moshe Rabbeinu, where did this concern of Yisro come from? If Moshe Rabbeinu's approach, we said, makes sense and is workable, it's something which would succeed. So then where does the concern of Yisro come from? That it was included then in Torah, both his concern and his suggestion, his solution. So in order to answer this question, we're going to go into a side discussion and explain something, and then we're going to come back and answer the question. So this idea, in connection to the concern of Yisro, which this story with Yisro occurred after the second set of luchos that were given on Yom Kippur, it occurred after that. So the concern of Yisro, that Moshe Rabbeinu estimated himself and the Yidden differently than what Yisro argued was the case. Moshe Rabbeinu said that the Yidden are able to and must be judged by him alone and learn from him alone. So this whole thing is similar to what we find earlier, immediately after the Aseres Adibros, which are connected to the first luchos. So this idea of Yisro, which we find in connection to the second luchos, we find something similar in connection to the first luchos. At that time, immediately after the Aseres Adibros, the Yidden argued that they are unable to continue hearing Koil Hashem Elokeinu Eid. They said they can no longer hear the voice of Hashem. And they asked of Moshe, they requested of Moshe, that Va'at Tadaber Leinu, that you, Moshe, should talk to us. And Moshe argued, as Rashi explains, it says Va'at Loshen Nekeva, Va'at Tadaber Leinu, that Moshe Rabbeinu said, he tashed them as koichi kanakeva. You weaken my strength like that of a nekeva, like that of a female. Shenetz ta'arti aleichem, v'repisem es yadi. I was distressed over you, and you weakened my hand. V'chi loy hoya yafelachem lilmin mipi agvura. Was it not better for you? Was it not preferable for you to learn directly from Hashem mipi agvura, v'loy lilmid mimeni, and not to learn from me? So this means that according to the way Moshe Rabbeinu estimated the Yidden, they should have wanted to, and they were able to learn Mipi Agvura. However, Hashem accepted the argument of the Yidden. Like Hashem said, Heitivu kol asher diberu. Everything they said is good, is correct. Like over here as well, Hashem agreed with Yisro. And so here too it's difficult. The same difficulty that we had regarding the story of Yisro. The difference between the level of Yidden, the way Moshe Rabbeinu estimated them, that they were able to learn directly Mipi Agvura, and their actual level, that they were unable to learn directly from Hashem. They had to learn from Moshe Rabbeinu. They're totally different, from one extreme to the other extreme. And like we indeed find that it says Itashtem Keichi Kenekeva. Why was Itashtem Keichi? Why was Moshe weakened? Because he saw the reality of the Yidden's level. And so we have this difficulty. How is it possible to say that Moshe Rabbeinu, he was the Raya of the whole Klal Yisrael, the Raya Neman of Klal Yisrael? It seems like he didn't estimate the Yidden correctly. He didn't estimate his Zayin, his flock, the Yidden, the Jewish people correctly, in a very extreme way. That was min hakatza lakatza from what he thought and the reality. So how do we understand that? One of the explanations that we can say about this is the meaning here isn't that Moshe Rabbeinu made a mistake in estimating and in evaluating the level of the Yidden. Rather, the meaning is that when Moshe Rabbeinu looks at the Yidden, when the Yidden are with Moshe Rabbeinu, so then they really are on a higher level and in a higher state that allows them to be able to learn and receive the Torah and Pi Gvura. And the reason for this is because Moshe Rabbeinu lifts up the Yidden and elevates the Yidden to his level. And therefore, just like Moshe Rabbeinu was able to learn Torah and Pi Gvura directly from Hashem, so too he brings about that the Yidden are able to learn Torah and Pi Gvura directly from Hashem. The Yidden, however, argued that this ability of theirs to learn Torah and Pi Gvura is only because Moshe Rabbeinu lifts them up. It's because Moshe Rabbeinu elevates them to such a level that they're able to do so. And therefore, their request is that they want to be able to take and absorb and receive the Torah with their klei hasaga, with their abilities, with their own koiches, on the level and state that they are on their own, not in the way that Moshe Rabbeinu lifts them up, when they are lifted to that place and then they're able to get the Torah, receive the Torah directly mi Pi Gvura. And it's regarding this that Hashem said, "Hey tivu kol asher diberu," that they're right, the Yidden are right, that they want to be able to receive the Torah with their own kaiches in the level and state that they are mitzad atzmam on their own. Because in this way, the Torah will be received and will be absorbed in their pnimius. Because it's coming from their level and their state, and it's not that they're being lifted up and elevated to a higher level. Now we're going to bring out a related point that supports this idea. According to this explanation, we can understand what Moshe Rabbeinu said, "He tashtem es keichi kanakeva." You weaken my strength like that of a female. Which this wording doesn't just reflect a feeling of pain, like Moshe Rabbeinu also said, nitzta'arti, but rather it mainly emphasizes the idea of weakness. Like Moshe Rabbeinu also said, urepisim, you weaken this yadi, my hand. And the question over here is, how does the weakness of Moshe fit in here? What is the weakening of Moshe? And the explanation is, in order for Moshe to learn Torah with the Yidden in the way that the Yidden wanted, which is va'at tadaber eleinu, that Moshe Rabbeinu should teach them Torah, and they shouldn't learn directly mi Pi Gvura from Hashem, so Moshe Rabbeinu had to descend from his level. Because if the level of Moshe Rabbeinu shines with the full force when he teaches the Yidden, so then the Yidden are going to be elevated by this greatness of Moshe, and they're going to be elevated to such a level that they actually need to learn mi Pi Gvura from Hashem and not mimeni, from Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore, there had to first be the weakening of the koyach of Moshe Kanakeva. There had to first be tashtem es koichi, a weakening and descent in the level of Moshe. And through that, he was able to be a mamutza between Hashem and the Yidden. So if the level of Moshe Rabbeinu would shine in full force, that would elevate the Yidden to his level, and then they're able to learn mi Pi Gvura. But the taina, the argument of the Yidden is that they wanted to learn from their level, where they are mitzad atzmam. And in order for Moshe Rabbeinu to teach them in such a way, there had to be a weakening, there had to be a descent, a yerida in the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. So that's the meaning and the emphasis over here of itashtem es kaichi, you weaken my strength, and repisem es yadi, you weaken my hand. Based on all of this, we can now come back to our earlier question, which was, if the perspective and the approach of Moshe Rabbeinu was definitely a true approach, and like we said, we could see it in the fact that this whole parsha was added by Yisro, and also we can see it from the very fact that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have this very obvious concern and simple solution. So our question was, then what's the perspective of Yisro? that Moshe Rabbeinu shouldn't be the one to teach and judge the Yidden. And we're going to start off with a lead-up that goes into the answer. And in the lead-up, we're going to first explain the perspective of Moshe Rabbeinu. Because until now, all we said was that perspective, that approach must be correct. But we didn't give the explanation for it. But based on what we just learned, now we have the explanation for it. And then we're going to lead from that explanation of the perspective of Moshe into understanding what was the perspective and approach of Yisro. And we're going to do it in two parts. The main thing we're going to do now, and then there's a small little piece that just didn't fit here that we're going to conclude in the next part. So when it came the time for Moshe to learn Torah, this is after the whole thing with the Yidden learning directly, hearing directly from Hashem, that they wanted to hear it through Moshe Rabbeinu. So now when it came the time for Moshe Rabbeinu to learn Torah with the Yidden and to judge the Yidden, so Moshe Rabbeinu estimated that Yidden have to hear all aspects of the Torah from him. The reason is because since Moshe learned Torah mipi agvura, he's the one that learned the Torah directly from Hashem. So therefore, nobody except for him can teach the Dvar Hashem with the whole air that is in the Dvar Hashem the way he's able to, because only he received it mipi agvura with the whole air that's there. Furthermore, since Moshe Rabbeinu is the one that is Anochi Eimid ben Hashem b'nechem, he's the one that stands between Hashem and the Yidden. Lahagid lochem is Dvar Hashem, to give over the word of Hashem. He's the Mamutza. And especially since Shechina medaberes b'tech greinish shel Moshe, the Shechina is talking through the throat of Moshe. So besides for the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah in Pi Gvura, and so only he could give it over with the whole air that's in the Dvar Hashem, besides of that, since when Moshe Rabbeinu is actually speaking, it's in a way that he's a mamutza, and that it's Shechina medaberes b'tech greinish shel Moshe, so it comes out that when you didn't hear Torah from Moshe, it's like hearing him in Pi Gvura. And this is also why Moshe Rabbeinu said, Ki yavei elai ha'am lidrei shalikim. They're coming to learn from Hashem. Why is he saying from Hashem? They're coming to him. And Rashi says, Lishol Talman mipi agvura. Because when Moshe talks, it's Shechina medaberes b'tech greinish shel Moshe. In addition to this, besides for the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu has the Torah in its authentic form, and when he's teaching the Yidden, it's in a way of Shechina medaberes b'tech greinish shel Moshe. In addition, since Moshe Rabbeinu elevates the Yidden and brings them close to his level, so when he teaches them and he's lifting them up and elevating them, so they will receive the Torah from him in a similar way to how he received them in Pi Gvura. In the Lashon of Chassidus, the level of Moshe is that of Re'iyah. He received the Torah in Pi Gvura in a way of Re'iyah. And Re'iyah is something which is much more powerful and close than Shmiya, which is at a distance. So in addition to the fact that you can't compare how a person gets something from someone who actually saw it to a person who gets something from someone who only heard it, so getting it from Moshe Rabbeinu is on a much higher level, because Moshe Rabbeinu's way of learning Mipi Gvura was in a way of Re'iyah, and like the Maimer Chazal, that ain't a daimish Re'iyah l'shmiya, you can't compare seeing to hearing. In addition to that, Moshe brought about, through elevating the Yidden, that also their way of getting it should be on the level of Re'iyah. So besides for the fact that he received it in a way of Re'iyah, by elevating the Yidden, he brings about that they should also get it on the level of Re'iyah. And like we're going to just tie it up in the next section, and that's the explanation and the understanding for the perspective of Moshe. Before we just said that for sure his approach and his perspective is correct, because otherwise he would have seen this obvious concern and simple solution. The fact that he didn't shows that he had his own approach and his own perspective, which is correct al pi Torah, and that's why Yisro was added a portion in Torah. Torah without this parsha doesn't have the perspective of Yisro; it has the perspective of Moshe Rabbeinu. And based on that, we're then going to lead into the answer to explain the perspective of Yisro. So first we'll just wrap it up, and then we'll lead into the answer. And it's for this reason that Yidden received the Torah from Moshe on the level of Re'iyah, that only Moshe is able to and must learn Torah with Yidden, to the extent that Moshe would judge them in everything, in every detail. Also the judgment was done through Moshe and in every detail. And it would still be in such a way that the Moshe would be able to manage, and also the Yidden would be able to be in peace. Now that we understand the perspective and the approach of Moshe, we're going to answer a question and explain the perspective and approach of Yisro. We're going to do it in two parts. And so this is the chiddush of Yisro. Yisro came from his land, he was a ger, and he saw the Yidden, the way they stand, not in a state and on a level where Moshe Rabbeinu raises and elevates them to his level, but rather he saw the Yidden the way they stand on their own level, mitzad atzmam. And therefore, he argued that judging the Yidden cannot be through Moshe himself. And the explanation is, when it comes to learning Torah, we needn't come to learn, like it says over there in the Parsha of Yisro, Esa Chukim Vesa Teres, they're coming to learn the Chukim, the Teres, Esa Derech Yelchuba, the path that they should go on, Vesa Maisa Shar Yasun, and how they should conduct themselves. So then it can be said that that itself, that they're coming to learn, accomplishes that the Yidden are elevated to the level of Moshe, and they are able to learn on his level. And therefore Yisro said, before he told Moshe to appoint judges, he said that when it comes to these things, Vizarta Esem Esa Chukim, you should be the one to teach them the chukim, the teres, haderech yelchuba v'samaisa. However, when Yidden come for a judgment regarding their own personal matters, which is including to work out divrei v'vaisim, their arguments, their fights, their disagreements, so then they aren't in the world of Moshe, and therefore at that time they're unable to be elevated to receive and learn the judgment of the Torah in the way of Moshe. And that's why, like we're going to continue to explain, we're going to continue the answer in the next part as well. That's why it requires that there should be Sarei Alafim, there should be other judges that are appointed under Moshe Rabbeinu. Continuing the answer and explaining even more the perspective of Moshe Rabbeinu and the perspective of Yisro. So, however, the situation is such that when the disputants stand in front of Moshe Rabbeinu, even when they're coming as two disputants, still that itself elevated them from their personal matters. How even a Ben Chamish Lemikra understands that the Ben Chamish Lemikra behaves differently when he's in the same room with his Malamed compared to when he's in a room by himself dealing with his own things. And it elevated them from their personal matters to the extent that Yidden are able to learn the judgment of Torah from Moshe on the level of Moshe. So the truth is, not only when Yidden come to learn Torah from Moshe are they able to be elevated to such a high level, but even when they come to deal with their own personal matters, the very fact that they're standing in front of Moshe, that itself elevates them. And so even when they come for a dispute, for things that are related to their own world and they're not in the world of Moshe, still, when they come and stand before Moshe Rabbeinu, that itself elevates them. And nevertheless, Hashem agreed with the suggestion and the argument of Yisro, because it's necessary to also consider the future when the Yidden will enter Eretz Yisrael, which will be after the passing away of Moshe. That even though they won't learn Torah from Moshe, because it'll be after his passing, so they won't learn Torah from Moshe and be elevated by him, the Torah, which is always Dvar Hashem, should still come to them through the Rashi Alpha Yisrael of that generation. And this now also explains to us the reason that Moshe didn't hold that he himself needed to do this. Because in addition to the fact that this idea that Arei Yisrael should change their conduct in order to address what will be after their passing is a chiddush, at that time there was no thought for any change in their situation, meaning that Moshe Rabbeinu would pass away. Since if not for the Averis of the Yidden that came afterwards, Moshe would be the one to lead the Yidden into Eretz Yisrael, and there would have been the final Geula when the Yidden would learn on the level of Re'iyah. So now we understand the perspective of Moshe and the perspective of Yisro. Moshe Rabbeinu's perspective was that even when the Yidden are coming for their own personal matters, and they're not in the world of Moshe, but by standing in front of Moshe, they get elevated to the level of Moshe, and they're able to learn directly from Moshe. And Yisro's perspective, Yisro's approach was that even though that's true, but nevertheless, since Moshe Rabbeinu would ultimately eventually pass away, so therefore it's necessary that the learning of Torah, which is always the Dvar Hashem, should still come to the Yidden through the Rashi Alpha Yisrael of that generation, of each generation. And on the other hand, Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't concerned for this, because besides for the fact that it's a chiddush that Arei Yisrael should be concerned about after their passing, there wasn't supposed to be any passing of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Yidden were supposed to go straight into the final Geula. So now we already answered our original question. However, now that we're on this topic, we're going to continue and elaborate upon it and explain a few other points that are related to it. Nevertheless, even though this was a suggestion, the concern and suggestion of Yisro, not that of Moshe, but nevertheless, this appointing of the judges must come through Moshe Rabbeinu. And the reason is because all matters of Torah, even those that are related to later generations, they all must come through Moshe. And like we see this in the Maimer Chazal of Kol Masha Talmud Vasik Asad L'Chadash B'Torah, that everything that a student is destined to be Mechadash, to innovate in Torah, Hakol Nitan L'Moshe M'Sinai, everything was given to Moshe Rabbeinu by Sinai. This means that even when a Talmud Vasik, a a student in a later generation is mechadish, meaning that it's a chiddush of that Talmud Vasek, that is also nitan l'Moshe Misinai. It was also given to Moshe Rabbeinu Misinai. And the reason for this is because since the Talmud Vasek came to this chiddush with their own seichel, with their own understanding, their own intelligence, so therefore the chiddush cannot be part of Teres Moshe. So even if it's a true idea and it makes sense, it's not part of Torah. It came from that person's mind. It's not part of Torah unless it comes through Moshe, which then it is Dvar Hashem Mamish. And so it has to be that everything that comes and is related to Torah has to come through Moshe Rabbeinu. And this is why Yisro told Moshe, he said, Va'ata techza, Rashi says, B'ruach HaKodesh alecha, with the Ruach HaKodesh that's upon you. He was saying that Moshe must choose and establish with his Ruach HaKodesh, the Sarei Alafim, who will judge the Yidden. It has to come through Moshe Rabbeinu. And this accomplishes for all generations that when the Chachmei Yisro, these judges, which are Smuchim Ish Mipi Ish Ad Moshe Rabbeinu, they have smicha one from the other, all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, that when they judge the Yidden based on the psakdin of their seichel, it shouldn't just be their seichel. It should be the judgment of Teres Emes and Teres Moshe. Because it was Beruach HaKodesh Alecha, it was Va'ata Techza with the Ruach HaKodesh of Moshe Rabbeinu. It came from Moshe Rabbeinu. So that brings about that all the judgments that the Chachmei Yisrael give shouldn't just be a judgment of their seichel, a psakdin of their seichel. It should be a psakdin of Teres Emes and Teres Moshe. Now we're going to continue and explain another point. Based on this, we can also understand why it says in the Parsha, Yisro told Moshe Rabbeinu, Va'ata techze, and he didn't say Va'ata tira. Both of them mean to see, but tira is Lashon HaKodesh, and techze is Lashon Targum. Because if Moshe would look with his Ruach HaKodesh on a level of Va'ata tira of Re'iyah, which is the Shleimus and Toikif, it's the wholeness and the full force of the level of Moshe, so then there's no need for the Sarei Alafim. Because like we said, then the Yidden are elevated to the level of Moshe. So, and specifically when there is a Yerid on the level of Moshe, from his level, similar to what we said, he tashed them as Kaichi, the level of Moshe has to be weakened. Now instead of Re'iyah, it's Techze, which Techze is the Targum of Re'iyah. Meaning, when we say it's a Targum, the way the Inyan of Re'iyah is translated and drawn down into Targum Lashon, which is in this world, it's a lower level, then does he see Yidden the way they are mitzad atzmam, and therefore he must choose Sarei Alafim for them, that they could deal with Yidden in their place where they are mitzad atzmam. And that's why the Parsha is called Al Shem Yisro, that Al Shem Sheyiter Parsha Achas B'Teira. The whole Parsha is called Al Shem Yisro, because mitzad the level of Moshe, there's a different approach. And even more so, in Torah mitzad atzmam, not just Moshe Rabbeinu, also in Torah mitzad atzmam there's a different approach. That's why we're saying this is a Parsha that Yisro added in Torah. From Moshe Rabbeinu's perspective, and even the Torah in its own, from there, in that level, in that perspective, there's a different approach. Yisro ever brought about a Yisro in Torah that also the approach of Va'ata techze is an approach of Torah. But otherwise, from Moshe Rabbeinu's perspective, and even from the perspective in Mitzad the Torah, the approach is that of Moshe Rabbeinu Va'ata tira, and Yisro brought about a Yisro, an additional Parsha in Torah, that also Va'ata techze is an approach of Torah. Also when it's Sarei Alafim, also when it's the Talmud Vasek Asid L'Chadesh, it's all coming from Torah, it's all part of Teres Emes, it's all part of Teres Moshe. And the Sicha concludes with a final point, another thing to explain over here, and that is, according to this, it l'cheira comes out that this approach of Va'ata techze versus Va'ata tira is only a yerida in order to address Yidden who need a mamutza between themselves and Moshe. Those Yidden who need a mamutza between themselves and Moshe, they need the Sarei Alafim. That's why we have Va'ata techze. Similar to how the Yidden needed Moshe as a mamutza between themselves and Mipi Agvura by the Luchos Harishonos by after the Aseres Adibros. However, in Pnimis Inyanim, it's Adarabah, it's the opposite. Specifically through addressing and elevating a Yid who is found in the lowest of the low, do we take and reach the highest of the high. It's specifically through addressing and elevating a Yid that's found in the Lamata Be'yeser, does a person reach the Gavaya Be'yeser. Similar to what the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe, writes at length in his Maimori Hilula, that it's specifically for the Avodah Lamata, which entails a tremendous battle with the Guf and the Nefesh Bahamas. So it's a very low place, it's a Yerida. are they the most precious treasures. They squander, they spend the most precious treasures that otherwise are not even shown. Here they're not only shown, they're not only used, they're used in a way of bizbuz. And the main intent of these aitzers is that they should reach the soldiers who are actually fighting the battle with their guf and nefesh bahamis. Those that are in a place of lamata beyeser. And this fulfills the kavanah al-yena of nisava kadosh baruch hu liyis leidira betachtenim. In olam haza tachten she'ein tachten lamata mimenu, which will be b'shleimus and begoli with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu b'karev mamash.